Welcome to Season 2 of Insurgency Unmasked. Join us as we explore the hidden stories and complexities of the Ukrainian conflict, and listen in as we deconstruct the war in Ukraine step by step, expert by expert. Welcome to another episode of Insurgency Unmasked with the modern insurgent. Today we're joined by Mike Godwin, also known as Mike Reports. Today we're going to be tracing the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So to kick off, Mike, how did you get started with your Instagram account? It's something that I know a lot of our other writers passionately follow. How did it start?
So the idea for running an Instagram or kind of a social media based news and open source intelligence, which has for some reason become such a touchy subject recently, but we're just sort of like current events page originally came many moons ago, many years ago, when I kind of had the idea from just seeing other people doing it. One of my close friends, I'm sure you know him, Our Wars Today has been a very popular one of them. There's a ton of others. We just don't have time to list all of them, but they do a really good job. And he was just one of many that inspired me. And in fact, he and I actually do co-host a podcast now. We've got it kind of grown into each other, but it just seemed like that was where you were really going to get actual news. And it seems strange, and it almost seems counterintuitive. Like, why would you get your news from social media? In fact, 5 to 10 years ago, if you had said that, people have thought you were the dumbest man or woman in the room, the dumbest person in the room. But it's slowly become arguably the more trustworthy source for an unbiased, detailed, factual representation of something that's going on as you're reading it, or at least within a few hours. I'm sure I'm reiterating what probably a lot of people think, which is kind of lost a lot of trust in mainstream news. And I'm not talking about just the big names in the US, but a lot of ones in Europe as well. Of course, what am I even going to say about Russian or Chinese media? Like, yeah, it goes without saying, but it just got to a point where, like, what is actually going on? And so I found some of these accounts like Our Wars and started following this. And I'm the kind of person, especially when it comes to conflict, I like to get into the very minute details, the tactical details, kind of thinly slice a certain, combat footage and really take it into and then try to interpret it. What does this mean? Oh, they're doing this, that could mean that they are short on supply or that, whatever it is. So anyways, fast forward to, like, I guess a couple of years ago, I'd already been working as a journalist here in Georgia, the country of Georgia. And I think I'd been doing pretty well. I genuinely enjoyed it. But the outlets I were writing for were, again, sort of the more mainstream. A couple in the US, one in Europe, and then more regularly here in Georgia. But they didn't really do that detail, that deep dive, I guess that intelligence-based research. They were kind of just more of the reporter, the man in the field reporting, and that's fine, but I really wanted to get into that. And so I was like, all right, well, I'm just going to create an Instagram account. And so, yeah, that's kind of just, it sounds simple, but that's basically what I did. I took a little bit of like a corporate-ish small business and kind of drew out a plan, a loose mission statement of what I was going to try and do and focus on. As some have stated, probably seeing my website or the Instagram account, I do have a general focus. I don't just go, like, I don't generally report on South America. I don't report on North America. I kind of focused on my Eastern Europe, of course, Georgia and the South Caucasus, Russia and all that, NATO, and try to just build that brand. And it's been a slow grind. I don't put any money in it, so maybe that hurt me. Maybe that hurts me, but yeah, that's just sort of how everything came to fruition.
And I think the open source intelligence community is incredible, to be honest. Like, the level of detail that it goes into, and just the community itself, it's tetchy at the minute, but there are some very good people in it. But how would you kind of describe open source intelligence to someone that had no idea?
So I guess in the layman's terms, I would just call it finding information by digging on the internet. And by digging, I mean Sometimes it's as simple as going on Twitter. I mean, some would call that's not true OSINT. Okay, fine. Some might say you can find a lot of it on Telegram, and of course you're going to find your people that say that's not true OSINT. And maybe you're right. Maybe that's just social media intelligence, but I would argue that there's layers to it. Everything from your social media to actually digging and finding some of the. There's a group here in Georgia that actually does incredible work tracing the movements of Russian troops, individuals via their social and their family's social media and their extended and they almost get this complete web map of units and how they've moved and these individuals, and it's shocking. I mean, they also do some things I'm not sure is quite all right, like posting their personal contact information, but that's neither here nor there. But the work they do is incredible by being able to find this. Sort of my flavor of it is getting into where this information originates. Some of it's Telegram, some of it's Instagram, some of it's Twitter or X now, and some of it's actually digging on VKontakte, which is like a Russian Facebook, or OK.ru, which is another social media that's pretty much Russia-ish exclusive. Some of it's digging in some of these. My Russian isn't great, but Google Translate's a wonderful tool. That's kind of that's the long version, I guess. But it's just digging in the dark corners of the internet to find information that is readily available. You just have to know how and where to look.
I've said it multiple times on this podcast. It's almost unbelievable to me how often I see people die. Like it's mad that it's that accessible nowadays. Like you can see everything from drone strikes to people running into trenches. It's quite terrifying.
It has changed the way you could almost call it the next generation in full transparency in world events. If you look prior to, I don't know, maybe the Vietnam War, when field reporting, combat reporting was really on the front lines. I mean, I guess you could say there was some in World War II, but the advent of color television and video camera changed it all. But you didn't really have as much. You certainly wouldn't be carrying a World War II camera, and certainly nothing even close to a World War I camera in those conditions. It wouldn't function. So you just had basically glossed over reporting, sanitized reporting, what would get through the censors at the time. And then I think sort of into Vietnam, certainly by the time you got to things like the Falklands War, the Troubles, and when you start looking at some of the Middle Eastern conflicts of the 80s, 90s, and of course, certainly by you hit the 2003 Iraq invasion, you've got to a point where mainstream news are getting on the front line in almost in combat. But even then, you're not seeing as much graphic content as you would see now. Either it would be scrubbed out because you just can't air that on for like the FCC or various government regulations. Just can't show a guy's head getting smacked off. Whether that's good or bad is purely up to the listener, but it is a form of censorship, whether you're just in that pure definition. But I think what we're starting to see now I think we saw it a little bit in the Nagorno-Karabakh war in 2020, and then some of the things in Libya prior to that. But certainly on a massive scale with Ukraine, we've seen this. I think the next chapter in and I guess full transparency of the front line, where I'm sure you and I have seen hours, unwillingly, involuntarily, of sadly people losing their lives, and it's a weird desensitization, because I'll put it this way. Somebody said this, I think, on Instagram. Probably people like us in our generation grew up before YouTube was A, heavily censored, and B, where you had like Live Leak and E-Bombs World, and I don't know if you can curse on the podcast, but E-effed, E-fucked. I think it was E-fucked, and that like something like, there was Faces of Death back in the day. There was all this stuff that if you knew where to find it, you were kind of like what edgy teenagers, edgy 12-year-olds, you could find, guys getting their head cut off by the pre-Al Jazeera. You could find all that stuff, but now it's like you really just got to go to Twitter, and everybody's got Twitter or Facebook. So it's, yeah, I think, and going back to what I said, I think it's kind of like another evolution in media. That's like I said, whether it's good or bad is up to the interpret, the viewer, but it certainly has changed, and that it's all become far more accessible.
Yeah. So the Ukraine invasion. Let's throw back to 2014, nearly a decade now, which is terrifying.
Yeah.
What happened in 2014? How did all of this start getting underway?
So it really goes back before even 2014, but without making this a 5-hour podcast like some Joe Rogan podcast, where it just goes on for hours. The short nutshell version of it is essentially Russia had been waging an information war in certainly Ukraine as a whole, but definitely the more, I would say, prior to their information campaign, a lot of Eastern Ukrainian, the Donbass citizens were more or less on the fence. Sure, they might call themselves Ukrainian, but sort of like in Texas in the United States, somebody from Texas might see themselves as Texan first and a very close second American. Something, maybe somebody from Scotland, certainly now with more of this movement to move away, somebody from Scotland might call themselves Scottish before they'll call themselves British. I think there was sort of this, I'm a Donbass, I don't know what the demonym is, a Donbassian or something. I'm a citizen of this kind of Novorossiya region of Eastern Ukraine before I'm really a full Ukrainian. And the Kremlin, you can see a lot going back to OSINT. There's a lot of information now that has come to light in years since, that essentially the Kremlin waged a long, subtle, almost undetectable at the time war via the media, via reporting, via getting people to kind of see themselves as more, maybe not Russian in the political sense, but Russian in the Slavic Rus in the ethnic sense, and less of the Kievan, Kievan Rus, Ukrainian, trying to pull people away. And so I think after years and even getting a more intense information campaign in those months coming up to it, and coming up to the Maidan, I think what you started to see is you could actually get people mobilized, which is what happened eventually. Is groups like the FSB, the GRU, we now know Wagner was involved. I think there were some others like Bastion, which is kind of a lesser known military PMC. A couple of others that are more or less confirmed, unconfirmed, but kind of this handful of shadow troops begin coordinating these paramilitary units, arming them. I mean, it's not like a case of AKs just pops out of the ground. Like, they were obviously getting this weapons equipment, heavier weapons, so BMPs, eventually main battle tanks and artillery, into the hands of these separatists that, of course, were largely recruited by these Russian agents. And so eventually that's where you start to see the clashes between Ukrainian troops that are, especially in the early hours, early days of this insurgency, this sort of uprising, which, if you look at a lot of the reporting at the time, that's kind of what everybody just thought it was this uprising, resistance, rebel group, when in fact it was a subversive mission by the Kremlin. And if you look at some of the reports or the reporting from the Ukrainian side, that's kind of what a lot of the police, the military, any of the security forces responding to this kind of characterize it as, oh, we got to go put down an uprising, or we got to go fight this armed gang group. And it wasn't until later that we started to find, no, it's a much more organized force than that. Also, it's mostly Russian, and now and then eventually we actually start to see regular Russian troops, particularly artillery units, moving into the zone.
That was certainly quite a development, and was going to be one of my next questions. At what point did it become Russian troops on the ground?
So that's I think for me, it's a little bit hard to pinpoint, because it depends on who you want to believe. Western sources, Ukrainian sources, obviously plenty of Russian sources said it just never happened at all. Crimea was a little bit different. That was more or less, yes, those are Russian troops. That was a little bit more of a slightly more transparent move by the Kremlin. Of course, that if you look at the poll numbers, like a popularity numbers for Putin, shot up, skyrocketed after Crimea came back. So that was a little bit easier. Yes, we have troops there, and yes, we're bringing that into the Russian Federation. Donbass was a little bit shadier. I think Putin kind of thought that if he went too hard, if he went too heavy with that, you might start to see a Western reaction. But if you could mire it in mud and mystery, you might be able to just have the big question mark. When we started to see that, yes, these are Russian troops, I would say towards the first winter, which the winter of 2014, 2015, when more information essentially pointed towards what I mentioned earlier. There's no way a local armed resistance group has this much logistics and baggage train, this kind of ammunition support material. I mean, everything down to, I mean, all the early pictures that were coming out of there was like, these guys are really well equipped. I mean, they've got, some of them have body armor, modern helmets, like modern for the time, plentiful, magazines of shells, BMPs of relatively new manufacture. You don't get that from Alibaba. So I think I would say towards the end of 2015 and definitely by 2016, it was all but confirmed. These are Russian elements. We just didn't know exactly. We couldn't say it was this unit of the FSB or it was this unit. It was Wagner, which Wagner kind of wasn't even on the radar that much at that point. But now we know that. So I guess it doesn't pinpoint, but I would say somewhere between the end, the winter of 2014 and 2016, the spring.
And why was Russia able to, how do I phrase it? How was Russia able to take Crimea so easily back in 2014?
So a lot of it, I think, is sort of this, nobody thought you could just walk into a country and do that. Nobody thought, it's kind of like nobody thought you could do it until somebody does it, right? It's a little bit of a shock. There was also the famous term little green men, which you couldn't, even back in those days, no OSINT could really definitively say, yes, those are Russian troops. It was kind of the first time we saw a regular standing army move in and do something, but without the accoutrement of a regular standing army. It was a little bit difficult to pin down. The other thing was the Ukrainian military. A lot of people have commented on this, and it's true. The Ukrainian military at that time in 2014 was leaps and bounds backwards of what it is, basically prior to the 2022 invasion. This is before any significant NATO and Western training and aid packages. So you still had, there had been some prior to that. I don't want to say that there wasn't, but it was nowhere near what happened after 2014 in the years, and certainly obviously not anything close to what we have now. So the Ukrainian military, as far as intelligence, communications, the ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, I don't think they were as coordinated as they are now to be able to kind of rally the troops and get some sort of either defense or just a coordinated withdrawal. So I think, while I will fault the Ukrainian military at that time for that, I think there was also a fair amount of corruption where the Russians, they do this in a lot of post-Soviet countries, but they did quite frankly, a really good job with the Ukrainians, where a lot of senior Ukrainian officers still harbored, like I said, on that fence, whether or not they held allegiances truly to Kiev, or if they were just, they saw Russia as still sort of a brother nation. They were Belarusified, if you will. And so I think there was a little bit of breakdown in that, where you could get away with that, where now a Ukrainian commander would immediately order his troops into a full mobilized state and put up resistance. So I think it was a combination of different factors combined with just good old-fashioned surprise.
Yeah. And the separatist movements is something I want to touch on a little bit. From kind of the beginnings of the civil war in the Donbass, how have they developed up until the Russian invasion? What were they up to in the civil war?
Up to the most recent Russian invasion. Yeah. So prior to that, you essentially saw what would you call the formalization of military units, kind of uniforming them, regimenting them. They went from essentially just if you can kind of just do a cursory Google search of a list of all the different volunteer battalions. Half of them don't exist anymore. They were either disbanded because they got shot up, their commanders were overthrown because they were getting a little bit too ambitious, or they were usually kind of melded together with other units to form, the first DPR Army, or the first Luhansk militia, People's Militia, I think is what they translates as. But so what you saw is it went from this kind of Russian soft-led, band of guerrillas, which is something not dissimilar we see in the Western doctrine, like in the U.S. Most famously, the U.S. Special Forces, that they go into places like Afghanistan and then meld themselves with these more local units for an internal defense, right? And so we saw them go from a kind of a local armed group led by Russian SOF or GRU or whatever, to something that's a little bit more organized, as the lukewarm war that consisted or continued post 2016, 2017 into 2021 and 2022. DPR, Lugansk, all of them started actually getting a little bit more organized under the Russian Ministry of Defense, forming actual battalions. These kind of groups of loosely led units. They got uniforms, they got equipment, they got actually a lot of their leadership, or the more trusted people, were sent to Russian military colleges to get actual formal training. And so you started to see them start to look a little bit more like an organized force. So when the 2022 invasion begins, Russia has a little bit more of a solid military ally, if you will, in the east, an anchor, if you will, so that they can push more towards Kiev and what we saw them do, Sumy, Kharkiv. And so I think the progression was gradual, but it was definitely bringing them into the Russian military fold. They started to even towards the 2022 invasion, when you started to see them actually start to resemble something like the Russian BTG, the Battalion Tactical Group. They didn't have the resources to emulate that exactly, but if you look at a lot of it's more outdated now, but the doctrine of a Russian Battalion Tactical Group, it actually says in its doctrine that not only is the BTG kind of the main maneuver element, but it's, this is my phraseology, but they are padded by local indigenous forces, which is to say the DPR, the LPR, now all the loyalists or the pro-Russians in the Zaporizhia and Kherson areas. They're meant to be, brutally put, bullet sponges for the actual Russian troops. I wrote quite some time ago about what would another invasion of Georgia look like if this was to happen again. Just because I'm here, I wanted to dive into that. And essentially, that was my thing, is you would see Russian BTGs, Russian military units that are padded and protected, or at least the first waves would be South Ossetians, Abkhazians, what are they called? The Cossacks, North Caucasians and Chechens. You would start to see the lesser troops, and that's essentially what we saw in Ukraine. Was as soon as 22 kicked off, in the east, it was the DPR and LPR, but that's also why they didn't gain as much steam as you saw some of those lightning strikes in the north, in the south as well.
It's something I've thought about quite a lot as well, the invasion of Georgia. I've spent quite a decent amount of time there myself and wrote an article about it as well. And a terrifying thought, realistically. And yeah, it would be the indigenous local people on the front lines dying on both sides. So it's not fun.
Yeah, even now, I think today's the 8th. So yesterday was the official, the 15th anniversary of the 2008 war. So it's, and then I don't mean to bring it up just because I'm here, but it is an important point. I'm not the only one. There's far larger political figures that have said this, that essentially the 2008 war in Georgia was kind of the prequel to the 2014 invasion of Ukraine and eventually the 2013. Arguably, you could even say some of the post-Soviet conflicts in Georgia and Moldova were also kind of the pre-prequels, the origin story, with the 2008 war just being the first actual let's go in full invasion. So,
yeah, it's a plan that's been in motion for a long time, realistically.
Yeah, and I mean, the Kremlin has its playbook. I mean, you can, if you dissect the 2008, 2014, 2022, I mean, it's gotten to a point where it's like it's the same rinse, wash, repeat, just with different flavors and different styles.
And there's a lot of comparisons between Grozny and some of the attacks used. So it does go on forever, realistically.
Yeah, there's been a lot of comparisons to the urban combat that we've seen in Ukraine now to Grozny, because it is. It's just on the Bakhmut. If you take a picture of Bakhmut now and Grozny in 1998, they're very hard to distinguish the two, maybe other than camera quality.
Yeah, fully. And that kind of leads me on to my next question. I could have understood if Russia in this 2022 invasion would have just gone for the Donbass. They'd have got away with it. I have no doubt about that. Why did they start bombing Kiev and Odessa? Where did that tactic come from?
So the bombing is something straight out of what they've done in Syria. Is essentially bomb and demoralize the enemy. They kind of thought the Syrians and the Ukrainians would react very similar to the Syrians, which is give up all the loyalists to Kiev. Kind of just take it. We just don't want the city reduced. A lot of people have said this as well, so I don't want to say it's like it's my personal revelation, but I think they genuinely thought that that Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, would pull a Saddam Hussein and essentially either try to flee to Poland or to the Czech Republic or something, flee west, or that he would just go into hiding and kind of operate from a deep bunker somewhere. I think they thought the Ukrainian military, I genuinely think that a lot of the intelligence that was fed to higher command was just the intel equivalent of yes men, just kind of giving you what you want, which is, if you dissect a lot of the Russian military culture, there's a lot of that in there. There's a lot of that in there in a lot of military cultures, to be fair, but I think it's endemic in the Russian military. And I think that built this sort of false picture that they painted for themselves that Kiev will fall, Zelensky's governments probably won't last more than a couple weeks or a month. The Ukrainian military, I think what they thought is a majority would either surrender or, change into civilian clothes, kind of do what the Iraqis did in Mosul with ISIS, change into civilian clothes and disappear. And then there would be probably about a third to a quarter of them that would be just hardcore dug in like a tick. And sure, the Russian military could deal with that. We'll take some casualties, we'll crush them, and there will be this huge parade, and it'll be awesome. And I think they genuinely thought they could, at the very least, seize everything east of the Dnieper River, Kiev, and probably, if you look at the map of Ukraine, at least the eastern half. If you look at a lot of leaked maps that kind of came out, there was a lot of things about how there could be a way for Ukraine to stay a country, but it would just be sort of this about the size of Hungary, kind of in the west, and the rest of it would just sort of be brought into the fold. And I think at most they would see a small amount of arms flow into the country from the west, from NATO, and a lot of banging and yelling at the UN and from Brussels. I thought they would get the same reaction they did in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine in 2014, which was a lot of condemnations, a lot of angry words, but very little in the way of real action. Of course, we see that all of that was wrong, and we see what's happening now. I don't think they anticipated that, certainly not the scale. So, yeah.
It's good you touched on the international support. Has a response like this ever really been seen before?
The only thing I can see that came close is almost what we saw in the kind of the war against ISIS, with the supplying the Iraqi military and the Peshmerga, the Kurdish fighting units. Um, I think we saw a little bit of that, probably not as much in the arms, but in the general support in means of, there was plenty of NATO countries, including France, Germany, the US, UK, that sent a lot of air assets, indirect fires, so artillery. There were several assistance units, so things like, I don't want to put exact units on the board, but I want to say there was at least some special operations units. I think there were some other more regular units that were in the area, if not directly fighting, certainly like right behind them. In Syria, that is. On the Iraq side, there was far more support. I think they got the air assets. We saw the Battle of Mosul, with I mean, certainly U.S. units engaging in combat with ISIS units, ISIS fighters. So that would be the only time I can see the international community coming together at that level in the modern, probably in the near modern era, maybe the 21st century. That would be about it, I would say. I think, and I still don't think that comes just as close, just because the breadth of arms and munitions. I mean, the shipping of hundreds of main battle tanks. That's a pretty big move.
So you touched on it earlier, how radically the Ukrainian military has changed from 2014 to now. How advanced is the Ukrainian military right now?
Right now, I think it's actually taking a step back. Just prior to the invasion, I think the Ukrainian military was at what it's probably been, at least for now, it's zenith. It's kind of pinnacle. They had been training with, I mean, UK, Canada, US, a ton of other NATO countries that have been doing various operations, training operations going there. I mean, months and months spent building them up. Of course, arms shipments as well, but again, not to the scale we've seen now. So I think that was at their pinnacle, and then through the first probably 6 months of the war, first year maybe of the war, it wasn't until I think we started to see probably the collapse of Solidar and the push by Wagner that Ukraine started to stagnate. I think mostly because of casualties. Speaking to people who have actually fought there, that's one of the things is, sure, even if the person doesn't die, they're still not on the battlefield anymore. And that's a person with months, if not more, of experience. It's one thing to lose a piece of equipment, like your tank got taken out or an artillery gun got disabled. That's fine. You can get more, or you can capture more, which is what they've done. But when you lose a lot of that experience, that knowledge, it affects it doesn't just affect a unit, it affects the entire maneuver unit's ability to continue its mission. There's a huge morale hit with that as well. I don't think that's really been appreciated by a lot of media outlets, a lot of analysis. Not some do, but I think that is what is starting to degrade the most, or starting to degrade the Ukrainian military's capabilities the most, is just the sheer toll that it takes. That's also to say, I think the Russians have suffered the same thing. They've lost a ton of higher command. They've lost a lot of men, a lot of middle management, middle leaders, that I think has severely crippled their ability to wage maneuver warfare in the way that we think of it as in the West, which is why nobody's really gained. You see a gain or lose a village here and there. And not to take that away, if you gain a height, that means a lot. But if you're looking at a strategic level,
it's almost been Russia's tactic for the last 200 years, hasn't it? Just flood more people in than the other side can really deal with.
It is. I mean, we saw the most famously in the Second World War, where, certainly more even contemporary accounts were like, this is absolute madness. You're just sending in unit after unit. And there's a lot of truth, I think, but I think it goes to a cultural level, a martial cultural level, where we value so much human life and you know, the fighting man, that to be alive in the West, whereas in Russia, it's okay if you die. It's glorious, and we'll praise you, and we can kind of do that whole rigmarole. There will always be another 5 men behind him, and that's sort of the honorable thing. Like, you're supposed to go die. I don't want to trivialize Russian culture too much on that, because I know there might be some people in the comments not happy with that one. But I think you'd be hard pressed to say that that's totally not true. I think there's a very different view in warrior culture, warfare itself, and of course just the generic culture overall. You know, I think the most the most famous quote, I think it was Patton that said, you know, the job of the soldier is not to die for his country, but to make the other guy die for his. And I think there's something to say about that goes deeper. In the West, we kind of don't want you to die honorably and in the glorious hail of bullets. We kind of want you to keep you alive. You know, I think if you look at the dollar amount per soldier that goes towards living condition, I can tell you from being in the military in the U.S., you live pretty nice compared to a lot of other militaries in the world. You have a nice house, a nice home or barracks. You know, you eat decently, actually pretty good food compared to what you might get in the Russian military or even here in the Georgian military. You live pretty well. You know, the dollar amount per soldier to keep them living happily and is pretty high compared to what they spend per soldier in the Russian military. And so to follow that, there's kind of an economic side to it. If a Russian soldier dies, we're out maybe a couple hundred dollars. If a U.S. soldier dies, we're out thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. So I don't know, maybe there's a little bit of economics behind that as well. But
The Modern Insurgent is completely independent. If you want to support our work and help boost independent journalism, please consider supporting us via Patreon at patreon.com/moderninsurgent. Thank you very much. So next we'll touch on the kind of the motivations behind the invasion. Why do you think Russia bothered going this far?
Oh boy, there's a lot of speculation in that, because I don't think we'll truly know, if we'll ever know, for at least a few years. You know, who knows the mind of a madman? I think that's very hard. But my own speculation on that is, a lot of people have likened it to, you know, wanting to reclaim the Soviet Union. I don't think that is a great comparison. I think it's the closer one is rebuilding the Russian Empire. Of the Tsar. I think Vladimir Putin, I mean, if you look at a lot of his references, they come from more imperialistic Russian Empire, the era of the Tsars, than it does from the Soviet Union. Some of his ideologies, which I don't profess to be an expert on the mind of Vladimir Putin. There are people who are far more schooled in that or have studied him far more. I've just done cursory research, watched a few documentaries that kind of dive into it, and you kind of amalgamate your opinions off that. But I think he wants to restore some era of empire, the old empire, to Russia. To be fair, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has not had it easy at all, ever. I mean, sure, they've had ups and downs, but if you look at things like economics, Russia's never truly been on par with Europe or the West. They've always been kind of seen, it's kind of like always having that kid, if you remember back in school, that was more or less laughed at, nobody took him seriously. It's kind of like that, where the opportunity to seize some form of greatness, you know, if presented, will be seized, whether that's economic or militarily, or geopolitically, just more broadly. Russia has long been considered sort of the gas station, the largest gas station of the world. They don't have much else other than that. There's not much else geopolitically that Russia has to wield, other than, you know, its large natural gas oil reserves and its military, which until, I would say, largely until this recent invasion, was kind of seen as not only people say the second best in the world, maybe the third or fourth, but definitely up there. Certainly after a lot of the reforms since 2014, a lot of the new equipment, you saw things like the T-14 Armada, the new Ratnik infantry group systems, all these things that when they came out, I was like, wow, okay, now you're starting to look a lot like the US, the French, the British armies. Like, you're starting to look this might be dangerous. All these advanced detection systems and everything that we no longer see, really. So I think there was this idea that bringing in Ukraine, which there has long been an idea that Ukraine was always supposed to be part of Russia. If you look at a lot of literature, not just from Putin, but a lot of his either his benefactors in his ideological benefactors, a lot of people, a lot of things kind of echo that Ukraine was always supposed to be part of the Russian Federation, part of the Slavic Russo fold. And I think the collapse of the Soviet Union and the kind of the quick dispersal of these countries like Ukraine, like some of others, Belarus never managed to get away. That's a good example of one that just they managed to keep their claw on. And I think if you look at even past Ukrainian presidents, which I don't profess to be an expert on Ukrainian, presidential history, but if you look at them, a lot of them have teetered on that line between pro-Russian and pro, separatist, if you want to call it that, or independent, whatever, moving away from the Kremlin. Russia has long tried to keep somebody, whether it's through guile or subversive action, trying to keep somebody in that position that was more or less manipulative, or able to be manipulated by their hand, so that they didn't drift too far out of their sphere. I'll liken it to Georgia, if I may, because we see it now where the current government, the current ruling party in Georgian parliament, routinely, from not just domestic but international politicians, are labeled as pro-Russian. And I think there's a lot of credibility to those statements. They're not just blank mudslinging, because I believe that there's a lot of backroom deals and discussions being had to make sure that things don't get too chummy between Georgia and the West. Same thing that was tried with Ukraine. So I think, in addition to his empirical or his imperial aspirations, I think there's also this sort of self-preservation, preserving the state, which they see Ukraine as. And when you can no longer preserve that through diplomatic or economic means, then you kind of lash out. But I think that's sort of a broad, very high level look at it. I hesitate to go too deep into that, like I said, because it's very, getting into the mind of the Kremlin, and it's a dangerous place.
And it gets even more confusing when you look at like the oligarch spread. Say Georgia, you've got Ivanishvili. Ukraine, you've got an endless amount of guys who made their money through Russian pockets and on the back of their local people, who are still in bed with Russia.
Oh, absolutely. You bring up Ivanishvili. Bidzina Ivanishvili, for those that don't know, is essentially the richest man in the richest Georgian, and the man bleeds money. It's obscene, particularly given the socioeconomic status of most Georgians. He's on another planet. But he essentially made his money through the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rapid, instant privatization of state industry, by scooping up all these cheap companies that were a dime a dozen and now are worth a lot, because most of them, if you look, I think most of them were mining and heavy industry. Now he's gone into some other things like hospitality and stuff like that, but made his riches in industry. And I know Ukrainian oligarchs are no different. They kind of make a lot of money off this opportunistic seizing of newly private industries, and it's very troublesome to look at that and say, how do you unplug that from this credible country? And it's not something you can just quit. You can't just tell them, say, nope, you can't have that anymore.
And it links incredibly well with the media and information warfare we've seen as well. How has that played a role in kind of the goings down. It's been huge. So especially on the Russian side.
Sure. So from the information standpoint, it's a masterful work of orchestral art from the Russian side. They do it. You got to give credit where credit is due, and they do an amazing job at manipulating information in the public. They've been doing it for 100+ years, ever since the advent of printing press and information. The Kremlin has been manipulating, certainly since the rise of communism and the Soviet Union, where notoriously information was very tightly controlled, especially from outside influences. So they have a masterful playbook on how to do that, and it's kind of a long game. And just like I was talking about with Donbass pre-2014, there was a long game of slowly getting people to see things differently, to see their world differently, to see themselves differently even. Like I said, they started to from being on a fence where, yeah, I'm Ukrainian, but I speak Russian. I have Russian family members. I've got family in Russia. To how dare you, Kiev, try to kill off a bunch of these Russian or ethnically Russian people, which never happened. But but they believed it like it was a word of God to a Christian. It was the God's honest truth to them. And it's a long, slow drip. There's kind of the old saying where even the mightiest and largest canyons start with just a little dripping water, and there's a lot of truth to that in the information warfare space, and Russia knows that, and they do it masterfully. And it's that slow drip of constantly making you not only slowly believe what they're saying, but question what maybe the opposition is saying. It's like I do admire it, because it is, I mean, objectively admire it, because it is a work of incredible trial and error. So,
and it's worked incredibly well on the left and the right wing in the West. Realistically, like, I've heard lots of questionable takes on the war from every perspective. Everyone seems to be sipping the teat of Russian disinformation, and it's worked.
Yeah, it's shocking to see how much reach it's got across the world. Like I said, it's that slow drip of making you question what you already know. And eventually that little slow drip starts to create the river, starts to create the canyon in some people's minds. It's kind of sad that it's allowed to been run, but therein lies sort of the paradox is, do you allow it for freedom of speech and freedom of press, or do you quash that because it's obviously just propaganda? And that's, as much as we'd like to say that's an easy choice to make, I think that's a very fine line.
I also think it works so well because the Western governments have lied a lot in the past, and there's clear horrendous decisions and mistakes that have happened. So
that's absolutely.
People are already looking for something to go wrong, I guess.
Exactly, and that kind of goes way back to our first kind of discussion about how I even got started in this business. Was people losing faith in a lot of mainstream kind of down home media outlets. I don't mean to pick on them, but they're just kind of the low-hanging fruit. CNN, a lot of people just stopped paying attention, stopped liking them, stopped following what they're saying, because they were wrong on a handful of occasions, just flat wrong. They brought on people that we now have evidence lied on national television. I mean, that's not some political hot take. We have actual evidence of these things they said that were not true. That's not everything. They do. To credit where credit's due, CNN does actually report news. There is, if you go to CNN.com, there's actual things that are going on in the world there. So don't take this as me trying to bash them. It's just they're the low-hanging fruit. Other outlets do it. Some do it less than others. Reuters and AP, I like to think, are a little bit better, but then there's ones like Fox and CNN and BBC that I think definitely have their biases, and it's sometimes it shows. So I think when that became more well known, I think, is when people started to question it and go to other sources that, things like RT or Rupley, Redfish, where it's like, do you actually know where RT? Do you even know what RT stands for? Like Russian television, like that's like, come on. Like I think there was a lot of people that didn't know that. That's simple. I know people that didn't know what RT or Rupley, what Rupley was. Rupley is a branch of RT, and it's absolutely state owned by the Kremlin, partially, I think.
Redfish was one I didn't know about until it came up on Instagram. I'd been following it for a couple of months, and it came up specifically saying it's Russian state-sponsored journalism, and I didn't even know it was based in Russia.
There's somebody with much more time on their hands than I do had actually made a good infographic that kind of connected all these dots between like Redfish, Rupley, TASS. There's a litany of others that kind of like distance themselves, but they're still very much connected. And sure, some of them may have some editorial flexibility to publish what they want, but there's always that connection to, the home base, where they cannot stray too far from that party line. And so, yeah, it goes back to what we said. Like, I think people lost faith in a lot of Western media, Western politicians. I think that's what some people maybe started looking to somewhere else. Sadly, I think they went looking in the wrong place. But where is the right place? And that kind of leads us to the social media news era.
And here we are.
And here we are.
So if you had to come up with kind of the three biggest battles of the invasion, a Bakhmut would be in there. What else would you throw up there?
Yeah, Bakhmut for sure. Bakhmut's kind of the easy one. I think that that's been for 10 or 11 months. I mean, gracious, that I can't even imagine. I think for the first one is the Battle of Kiev, which kind of wasn't a battle, but a series of battles that if there's people on YouTube that have done a far better job of chronicling exact movements. But I think that, God, I know there's going to be some pro-Russian or some edgy person in the middle that's going to question or be like, what are you saying? That was absolutely a victory for Ukraine. There's no question about that, because there's no Russian forces around Kiev now. That's a very simple black and white military theory answer. And I think it was one of the greatest upsets in modern military combat history in the 21st century. I think that will, and people still do. The Modern Warfare Institute at West Point does a great podcast or episode where they kind of dissect it from a tactical standpoint. And I don't work for them. I just think they did a good job on it. So full transparency there. But yeah, I think that will go down in military history as one of the most shocking upsets that I think, I was one of the guys in February 23rd, 2022 that said, A, there's not going to be an invasion, and B, if there is, Russia's going to sweep the floor with them. I was one of those people, and I was absolutely wrong. I'm kind of glad I was, but I think the Battle of Kiev, I think the Battle of, it's kind of combination, but Sumy and not Kherson, Kharkiv, the northeastern part of the country, I think, especially Kharkiv, that Russia was never actually able to take. They surrounded it, they were cut off. And I think that'll also go down as a kind of an Alamo moment, where the defenders were able to outlast, outwit, and defend against a far superior Russian force until the Russians just gave up and said, we're going home. So I think those two would be some of the big ones. And then I think the last one that I would include in that list is Mariupol. Everything from the battle itself to the resupply efforts that Ukraine did, that, if you look at some of the absolutely harrowing things they did, flying feet above the ground in these Mi-8 helicopters just to get people and guns and ammunition and food into the city. Several of the helicopters were downed or got hit something. Like, but the fact that they were able to do it and get people like medics and wounded and press out of the city, I'm shocked that doesn't. Eventually, somebody will make a movie about it, because it's just like, how do you not? But it's incredible. I think the Battle of Mariupol, while obviously it was a victory for the Russians, I think it'll go down as one of those like.
Was it the steel plant was in Mariupol, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Azov,
yeah. Yeah. If there's not a movie made about that, I'll be blown away. I completely agree with you, to be honest.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, that's. I think that one will also go down as a textbook example of how to utilize the urban terrain effectively in defense, despite being basically little to no chance of survival. How you can basically make them pay for it. And I think between Bakhmut, obviously the battles of and around Kiev, and then Mariupol, I think those battles were so taxing on the Russian and their forces that it may not be the biggest factor, but I think it's still, to this day, a contributing factor of why we have seen very little to no advance from the Russian side.
Yeah. And what do you think the impact's been on Ukraine's political landscape?
It's hard to say, because every time I try to dig, they've done a very good job of keeping a lot of their internal politics very hush, which is good for them, because you don't want a lot of this kind of dirty laundry getting out when everybody needs to look united. I think the political landscape has undoubtedly changed behind the curtain, in that there's certainly, I think everybody's kind of looking over each other's shoulder. How do you not in a situation like this? I just saw something, I don't remember what outlet it was from, so take it for what it's worth, but I think there was some lady who was close, kind of a female, who was inside sort of I don't know if she was in the Rada or just in Zelensky's circle of people, that's been detained relative either today or yesterday, on suspicion of being a spy. I think that fear has permeated a lot of Kiev. And I mean, how do you not? I mean, Russia does have its tentacles in a lot of the east of its sphere of influence, undoubtedly, and they've been there for a long time. It's hard to get those tentacles off. So I would be shocked if there wasn't sort of a double checking of everybody's, who are they who you think they are. We've seen a few minor shuffles in commands, people be getting moved around or fired. Hard to say why, because of course they don't really comment on that, which, to be fair, it's wartime. You probably don't want to do that, but I would say that it's more tense than it has been before. I think everybody's sort of watching. Everybody's watching everybody else. It's a little bit tense. I'm sure it's not very comfortable in those operations rooms, but yeah.
I can imagine it's never comfortable in an operation room, but certainly there.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Fair.
And then for our final question of today, do you see any potential pathways to resolution?
Ooh, this one's going to be unpopular. So the way I see it, this is, again, kind of going out on my own assessment, my own, I want it to stand on its own. My only way I see this being resolved, the only way, is I think through some sort of agreement between NATO, EU, the West, and Russia. If you look at the rhetoric from Kiev, from Zelensky himself, he's pretty much buried himself in a hole where he really can't back down from that. Like, he cannot make an agreement and politically survive, or maybe even realistically, literally survive. He's constantly made promises. His staff have constantly made promises about going back to 1991 borders, retaking Crimea. If I'm just being brutally honest, I don't see that happening. Like I said, I didn't think the invasion would happen at all anyways, and I was wrong. Maybe I'll be wrong about this. I very well could be. I've been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again someday. But I think I just don't see that in the cards from a strategic, battlefield standpoint. I just don't see that. So I think what's going to happen, and there's no way, just to be clear, there's no way I see Russia retaking significant territory. Certainly not any significant cities. Kherson, nope. Kharkiv, nope. Zaporizhia, nope. Certainly not Kiev again. I just don't see them taking any strategically important cities or areas. So what I think is going to happen at some point is, for politics, for the show, the dog and pony show, the West is going to have to make it look like they're pressuring Zelensky into some sort of agreement, some kind of agreement. I don't know what that really looks like. I'll get to that in a minute, what I think it might look like. But essentially, they're going to have to push him against the wall and say, you have to sign this or we're done. And we're going to pull the plug on the support and you're going to go underwater. Because that allows Zelensky to turn around and go to his people and say, I didn't want to sign this agreement. I didn't want peace, or I didn't want to do this, give up these territories. The West made me do it. And here we are. We kind of have to do this. And that's a lot easier to politically survive. And that way, both sides can essentially walk out. Russia can say they've won by liberating all these territories. Ukraine can say they've won by surviving and not being overrun. They're still a country. They still have a coastline. They still have a variably functioning economy and an actual military that was, I think, bigger than it was pre-war. So they can come. So, like I said, everybody can walk away from the table and say they won. That's kind of what everybody wants. That's what I think what's going to happen eventually. What that actual agreement looks like, sadly, from my opinion, it's going to look like a repeat of the Minsk agreement that essentially stopped the Donbass 2014 invasion or war, whatever you want to call it, which is, some sort of DMZ or demarcated line, the line of control, or, they can't call it a border, but they'll call it something else. Ukraine will continue to promulgate its whole, these are occupied territories. Russia will continue its whole, these are, now welcome back to the motherland sort of thing. The stupid images, all the bear cubs coming over to the mother bear. All this stuff will go all over the place on social media. But ultimately, on the ground level, there will still be skirmishes. It'll look just like it did 2022, 2021, not 2022, 2020, 2019, 2018, where you sort of have these low-level engagements, everything from squad to platoon size engagements, artillery duels, sniping, and the entire line of contact is an inhospitable wasteland that still can't be really populated, just like it was in Donbass, where you had bombed out cities that were the front line. I think that's what's going to happen. It's sad to say that we just go back to what it was. However, there's one thing I want to note. And a lot of people have said this. What does that actually give Ukraine? Because what Russia now is able to do is rebuild their military for part two, right? The only way I think if I was Zelensky that I would agree to something like this is some kind of military agreement or some sort of clause in the agreement that says we get a NATO base, or we get a temporary rotating NATO garrison, or we get some sort of agreement from European countries that if this happens again, you guys are actually going to come into the fight and you guys are going to put some skin in the game. That's what I would do if I was Zelensky. I would say, okay, you guys pressure me to sign this agreement, so I politically survive in my own country. But so that this never happens again, and Russia doesn't just, recharge and come again, we get a NATO base outside Kiev.
Yeah.
We get a permanent NATO garrison, at least one. That's what I would do. And I think the combination of all that stuff I've talked about, I think some form of that has to come to fruition for all parties to be happy, or most parties to be happy.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you, to be honest. So it's a perfect end to the podcast. It's been an honor to have you on, Mike.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Joe.
So if anyone wants to find you on social media, what is your handle?
So it's just Mike Reports, just one word. I think my Instagram has like a couple of like little underscores, because somebody took Mike Reports and never used it. Jerk. But pretty much if you just type in Mike Reports, one word, in any social media, Instagram, Facebook, but I don't really use it, Telegram, Twitter, if you just type it in, there's a stylized white background with an M-R. It's pretty obvious. You'll see it. That's me. Check it out. I do a lot of work for some of my partners, like at Atlas News. So occasionally you'll see me sharing content from there. They're good people. They do it. We have a lot of fun. In fact, interestingly, the Modern Insurgent, we had Antoine Brimball, the founder. So little cross promotion. You guys go check out him too as well. It was super fun. We got into some weird topics, but it was a lot of fun. But yeah, just check me out there, and I'm usually publishing something at some random time.
Fantastic. Yeah, Anton said he had a great time coming on your podcast.
Yeah, we go. Well, we talk about Serbia, Russia, Ukraine, dragons at some point, vampires. Yeah, it got a little sideways, but it was a ton of fun.
We love a bit of Balkan mythology.
Yeah, I got a little weird, but we had a ton of fun. Yeah.
So I recommend everyone go check that out as well. Go find Mike's other work and the podcast with Our Wars Today, because Our Wars Today is also a fantastic. I'm a follower of the Telegram and the Instagram. Fantastic news source. So everyone go have a look at open source intelligence. OSINT is worth it. That's my recommendation for today. So thank you and goodbye. The Modern Insurgent is your impartial, independent and academic guide in deconstructing the world's conflicts and insurgencies through our unique documentaries, podcasts, reports and scholarly articles. Reporting on the underreported.